History often remembers the children of Nicholas II in reverse. Most people encounter them at the very end, in a cellar in 1918. As the doomed children of a collapsing empire, they appear almost like ghosts, moving backward through time. Anastasia Nikolaevna becomes a legend. Alexei Nikolaevich becomes the sickly heir. The Romanov daughters in white dresses become symbols, the last innocent faces of Imperial Russia. But long before they became symbols, they were simply children, 5 siblings growing up inside one of the strangest contradictions in modern history. They were born into extraordinary power, raised behind palace walls, surrounded by servants, guards, titles, and strict rituals. And yet, inside that world, their parents tried to create something very different. A home life that was controlled, modest, and almost deliberately ordinary. Nicholas II and Alexandra Fedorovna had 4 daughters: Olga Nikolaevna, Tatiana Nikolaevna, Maria Nikolaevna, Anastasia Nikolaevna. And then, in 1904, after years of pressure to produce a male heir, they finally had a son, Alexei Nikolaevich. From the outside, it looked like the perfect imperial family, but inside it was something far more fragile. A world built on tenderness, discipline, anxiety, secrecy, and a growing sense, though not fully understood, that history itself was moving toward them. The children spent most of their early years at the Alexander Palace, not in constant grand ceremonies or endless royal display, but in a quieter, more controlled environment. This is one of the biggest surprises in their story. Their parents did not want them to grow up as delicate royal ornaments. They wanted them to be strong, disciplined, religious, and deeply connected to each other. The daughters slept on simple camp beds. They took cold baths. They ate plain food. Their routines were strict and structured. Lessons mattered. Manners mattered. Wastefulness was discouraged. Even inside a palace, restraint was enforced. This was not because they lacked wealth. It was because Alexandra believed luxury could weaken character. So the children grew up in a strange balance: imperial privilege, combined with almost severe domestic rules. It was a kind of royal minimalism. A family living at the center of one of the richest empires in Europe, while trying to live as if discipline alone could protect them from the outside world. Inside this private world, the 4 sisters formed their own small universe. They were so closely connected that they were often referred to as a single unit, OTMA, from their initials. But they were not the same. Olga, the eldest, was intelligent and sensitive. And as she grew older, she began to understand the dangers surrounding her family. Tatiana was composed, elegant, and naturally regal. Maria was warm, affectionate, and open-hearted. Anastasia was energetic, mischievous, and full of humor, the kind of child who could light up a room instantly. Together, they created a world of their own, a world filled with private jokes, shared rooms, small arguments, and deep loyalty. In many ways, their emotional center was not the empire, it was each other. Life inside the palace followed a strict rhythm. It was structured, controlled, and rarely spontaneous. Tutors came and went. Lessons filled most of the day. The Romanov children were taught languages, history, geography, religion, and literature. But their education was never just academic. They were being shaped into something more. They were being trained in posture, discipline, and self-control. They were expected to become grand duchesses, but also remain obedient daughters. In that household, discipline wasn't occasional. It was the atmosphere. Even the smallest details mattered: how they sat, how they spoke, how they carried themselves. And yet, despite all this structure, their childhood was not cold. Nicholas II was, by most accounts, a gentle and affectionate father. He preferred quiet family moments over the harsh realities of politics. Time with his children, away from court pressures, was when he seemed most at peace. Alexandra Fedorovna, often seen as distant in public, was deeply attached to her children. Her love was intense, protective, almost consuming. The family took photographs together, they played games, they went on walks. They spent time boating and enjoying simple routines. From the outside, they ruled an empire, but inside, they often looked like an ordinary family trying to escape pressure. And that was the paradox. The Romanov children were raised in love, but also in isolation. They were protected. But that protection slowly became a barrier between them and reality. They were not being prepared for the modern world. They were being prepared to trust the family and little else. And at the center of that family was one child who changed everything: Alexei Nikolaevich. His birth was not just a personal joy, it was a dynastic necessity. A monarchy built on succession needed a male heir. And Alexei was the answer to years of pressure. But almost immediately, that joy turned into fear. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even small injuries dangerous. A simple bruise could become life-threatening. A fall could lead to days of unbearable pain. At the time, there was no real cure, no reliable treatment. Every injury carried uncertainty, every moment carried risk. His illness transformed the emotional climate of the entire household. It made Alexandra more anxious, more withdrawn, more desperate. It turned the future Tsar into a fragile child in a nation that valued strength. And it introduced one of the most controversial figures in Russian history, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin seemed to have an unusual ability to calm Alexei's suffering. Whether through hypnosis, presence, or coincidence, his influence became undeniable in the eyes of the royal family. To them, he was a lifeline, but to the outside world, he was something else entirely. A symbol of corruption, superstition, and weakness inside the monarchy, and this secret dependence damaged the empire's image more than they realized. Inside the palace, he was trusted. Outside, he made them look vulnerable. The Romanov children grew up inside this tension. They adored their brother, but Alexei was never just a sibling. He was the future of the dynasty, and a constant reminder that the future itself might not survive. His sisters protected him. They entertained him. They adjusted their lives around his condition. Especially Anastasia Nikolaevna, who was known for making him laugh even in moments of pain. The family revolved around him emotionally. And because of that, illness became part of everyday life. While other royal families in Europe symbolized stability and confidence, the Romanovs lived with quiet fear. They knew, even if they didn't say it, that everything they depended on was fragile, and beyond the palace walls, the empire itself was beginning to crack. By the time the children were growing older, Russia was already unstable. The rule of Nicholas II had been shaken by the Russian Revolution of 1905. There was labor unrest, political violence, deep dissatisfaction across society, but inside the palace, life continued almost unchanged. The children still read, still embroidered, still joked, still followed routines. They lived in a world where it was still possible to believe that faith, loyalty, and family could hold everything together. But that illusion was already breaking outside. They were the children of an autocrat, growing up in a world that was turning against autocracy, and with every passing year, the gap between their sheltered lives and the reality of Russia grew wider. Until finally, that gap could no longer be ignored. The moment that changed everything was war. When World War I began, the Romanov children could no longer remain protected inside their private world. The distance between palace life and reality collapsed. Russia was pulled into a massive, devastating conflict, and suddenly, the imperial family was no longer just symbolic. They were part of a national crisis. For the first time, the children were pushed into roles that felt real, immediate, and adult. Alexandra Fedorovna, along with her eldest daughters, Olga Nikolaevna and Tatyana Nikolaevna, trained as nurses. They worked in hospitals. They treated wounded soldiers. They witnessed things they had never been prepared for. Blood, pain, amputations, endless suffering. This was not the world of palace gardens and quiet routines. This was modern war. Maria Nikolaevna and Anastasia Nikolaevna were still too young to serve formally at first. But they visited hospitals. They tried to comfort injured men. They offered emotional support, smiles, conversations, small moments of relief. On paper, it looked powerful. The emperor's daughters, raised in privilege, now standing beside the wounded. But in reality, it changed them, especially Olga. The suffering she witnessed broke the illusion that had surrounded her childhood. For the first time, the outside world was no longer distant. It was right in front of her. And it was brutal. The war did not just transform Russia. It transformed what it meant to be the children of Nicholas II. But even as they tried to help, the monarchy itself was falling apart. As the war dragged on, things grew worse. Alexandra Fedorovna became increasingly unpopular. Her German background made people suspicious during wartime. Her reliance on Grigory Rasputin made the situation even worse. Rumors spread rapidly. Many believed the royal family was out of touch or even betraying the country. Meanwhile, Nicholas made a critical decision. He left the capital to personally take command of the army. That decision left a political vacuum behind, and it was filled badly. Public anger grew, trust collapsed. By the later years of the war, the Romanov children were still loved by those who knew them personally. But they were trapped inside a system that people had begun to hate. And that is one of the deepest tragedies of their story. They were kind, disciplined, and sincere, but they were inseparable from the monarchy, and when the monarchy fell, they fell with it. In early 1917, everything finally broke. The Russian Revolution of 1917 erupted. Riots filled the streets of Petrograd. The government collapsed. The army began to lose loyalty. And in March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. For a brief moment, he considered leaving the crown to his son. Alexei Nikolaevich, but he changed his mind because of Alexei's fragile health even at the end. A father's fear outweighed the fate of an empire. And in that single decision, everything changed for the children. They were no longer heirs, no longer grand duchesses, no longer symbols of power. They became prisoners. At first they were confined in their own home. The Alexander Palace, the same place where they had grown up, but everything about it had changed. The walls were the same, the rooms were the same, but now they could not leave, guards watched them, rules controlled them, freedom disappeared. It was a strange kind of transition. One day they were at the center of an empire, the next they were living under surveillance, and yet, in the beginning, there was still a sense of unreality. The family was still together. They still tried to maintain routines. They prayed, they read, they cared for each other. The daughters continued to look after Alexei Nikolaevich, whose health remained fragile. They tried to preserve dignity, but their world was shrinking. Slowly and then all at once, even small details began to change. After illness, their heads were shaved, their daily life was restricted, their schedules were no longer their own. They had been raised with structure and order. Now they lived under imposed rules, and something deeper was happening. They were beginning to understand that a life can look the same on the outside, long after it has completely lost its meaning. Later in 1917, they were moved again, this time far away to Tobolsk in Siberia, further from power, further from hope, and closer to the unknown. The move to Tobolsk in Siberia marked a turning point. It was no longer just confinement inside a familiar palace. It was exile, a deliberate removal from the center of Russia and from any possibility of return. The Romanov children arrived in a place that felt distant in every sense, geographically, politically, emotionally. Yet at first, life there still carried a strange resemblance to normality. The family remained together, they read books, they sewed clothes, they wrote diaries, they prayed. They tried to maintain routines, as if routine itself could hold the world together. Olga Nikolaevna, Tatiana Nikolaevna, Maria Nikolaevna, Anastasia Nikolaevna, and Alexei Nikolaevich continued to live as a family unit. That is what makes this phase so painful in hindsight. It was not chaos yet. It was waiting inside a collapsing country, waiting inside a story they could not influence, waiting while adults made decisions that no longer had clear control over anything. The children behaved in the way many sheltered young people do in moments of crisis. They tried to be obedient. They tried to be brave. They trusted their parents, and they waited for the world to become stable again, but stability was gone. Outside Tobolsk, Russia was breaking apart further, civil conflict intensified, authority shifted rapidly between competing forces. And the Romanov family, once the symbol of imperial unity, became something else entirely. Not rulers, not citizens, but political material. Alive, they were valuable. Dead, they would become symbolic. And so their movement continued. In 1918, they were transferred again, this time to Yekaterinburg. The atmosphere changed immediately. This was no longer a quiet exile, it was something more final. The guards were stricter, the environment was harsher. The sense of isolation deeper. They were now held in the Ipatiev house, a building that would later become infamous. Inside, their world had narrowed even further. Rooms, guards, walls, silence. The old life, lessons, walks, hospital visits, family jokes, had been reduced to surveillance and uncertainty. What makes this stage of their story so haunting is not just what was happening, but the contrast between who they were and what was happening around them. Olga Nikolaevna was in her early 20s by then, old enough to understand fragments of the situation. Tatiana Nikolaevna remained composed and disciplined, even under pressure. Maria Nikolaevna still appeared gentle and emotionally open in recollections. Anastasia Nikolaevna kept a sense of humor and energy that others remembered vividly. And Alexei Nikolaevich remained physically fragile, dependent on care, and central to the family's emotional focus. None of them ruled Russia. None of them made the decisions that led to collapse. Yet they carried something unavoidable: their name, their bloodline, their symbolism, and in revolutions. That alone can be enough. By July 1918, the final stage of their story arrived. The situation in Russia had reached its most unstable point. Competing forces moved rapidly. The old order was gone. And the Romanov family had become a problem no side wanted unresolved. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, Nicholas II, Alexandra Fedorovna and their children, Olga Nikolaevna, Tatiana Nikolaevna, Maria Nikolaevna, Anastasia Nikolaevna, and Alexei Nikolaevich, along with loyal attendants, were killed in Yekaterinburg by Bolshevik forces. It was not a public execution in a grand setting. It was not ceremonial. It happened in confinement, in a closed room, far from the world they had once been taught to rule. And that detail matters deeply, because these were children raised under rituals, portraits, and expectations of destiny. And they died as prisoners of a revolution determined to erase that very world. Their deaths did not just end a family line. They ended an entire symbolic universe, Imperial Russia, but even after their deaths, their story did not end, it transformed, because the secrecy surrounding the event allowed something else to grow, myth. Rumors spread for decades that some of the children had survived. The most famous was Anastasia Nikolaevna, with multiple imposters claiming to be her. The idea that one of the Romanov children had escaped became one of the most persistent legends of the 20th century. It reflected something emotional rather than historical, a refusal to accept total loss. For a long time, the truth remained uncertain in public imagination, but later science ended the mystery. In the 1990s, DNA testing identified remains consistent with the Romanov family, confirming the fate of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children. The myth closed, the uncertainty ended. And what remained was something more difficult to process, not disappearance, but finality. So what was life really like for the children of Nicholas II? It was not a fairy tale, but it was also not simply tragedy from the beginning. It was something more complicated, a life built inside contradiction, intimacy inside ceremony, love inside anxiety, privilege inside isolation, discipline inside uncertainty. They were raised with affection, but also behind walls. They learned duties. While the world outside was breaking, they formed their own small universe as siblings, while inheriting a collapsing empire they could not control. And that is why their story continues to resonate. Because it forces a difficult question onto history. What happens when children are raised to inherit a world that is already dying? In their case, the answer was not inheritance, it was collapse. They did not take the empire forward. They went down with it.